hear me okay? If you can't, it's John's fault, not mine. As Mary said, this is my 10th outing, and it's also, I think, my last. I'm kind of going into retirement after this, at least for the time being, and I'm in constant expectation that I will be putting in my pension application soon. But it's been an amazing 10 years. I don't know if anybody here can remember the very first of these talks. It was actually held up in the reading room, which seems a very odd venue, but at the time it seemed very appropriate all those 10 years ago. It won't escape your notice that there's no PowerPoint. It seems impossible nowadays to go to a lecture without PowerPoint. Apart from the fact that I personally don't like it, I thought, given that this topic is a history topic, it would seem appropriate that the means of delivery should also be historic. So it's just one man and a slightly augmented voice. This isn't going to be a talk on the 3rd Brigade or on the volunteers. Obviously, that's far too large a topic. Sean Hogan is here tonight. He's done a wonderful book on that period covering North Tipperary. Tom Toomey from Limerick, a very good book on Limerick. The one gap that's there really from this region is South Tipperary. So I've been working on that. I'm still working on it for the last year or so. So what I hope to do tonight is simply touch on some of the issues that arise, some of the questions to which I may not have answers. As I said, it's still very much a work in progress. And I've picked just 8 things that I can touch on. I might not get around to all 8 because I think if we're in each other's company for an hour, it's really more than enough. So depending where I got to in an hour, I'll probably shut up. But the 8, as I said, it is these 8, but it could just as easily be another 8. Just to look, first of all, the nature of the exercise, kind of philosophical. How do you approach dealing with that period? When I was thinking about what this topic was going to be for this 10th series, I had initially thought of, because I have some work done on agricultural societies in the county in the 19th century, which is actually more interesting than it sounds, because it had to do with landlord-induced or promoted agricultural improvement. But then I thought to myself that any audience that would come to that would have such strong feelings on that topic that it was probably easier to talk about the 3rd Brigade, about which you would have no feelings whatever. So the 3rd Brigade is what I ended up. As I said, it's very much a work in progress. The 8 topics that I can only touch on very briefly, and as I said, this is very much a view from a helicopter rather than a view from the ground. As I said, the nature of the exercise, just to look at the volunteer movement, because the 3rd Brigade has to be put into that context, which is a bigger context of the volunteer movement. Then, of course, there's that, well, it's a wall or a door, you can take your pick, Dan Breen's book, which is something of a monument, however one wants to regard it. The issue of the ambush itself, but particularly the immediate aftermath, which I think is of particular interest, rather than the ins and outs of the ambush. The role of the RIC, and particularly their very peculiar means of policing, which I'll hopefully come to, and the issue of the leadership of the 3rd Brigade, which bizarrely, as much as anything else, was a leadership in absence. The role of Ernie O'Malley, which is kind of overlooked. And then another aspect, which I may not get to, but is of great interest, is the fact that given the disruption that was there during the War of Independence period, you had a lot of people who were ready to seize their opportunity with regard to land issues, most of which had been resolved in the county, but not all. And that's, again, it's an aspect of this that's often overlooked. Now, how many of those I will actually get to, I'm not sure. The first one of those, as I said, is just the nature. How do you approach, if you're going to investigate a period like the War of Independence in South Tipperary, or anywhere else indeed? And I suppose the choice you have is you can either approach it as a celebration or an exploration. And my choice is very much an exploration. I think 100 years on, that's something we ought to be able to do. And of course, the R word immediately comes up, the issue of revisionism. I would very much be of the view that all historians are revisionists. That's assuming that they are historians and not anecdotalists or folklorists. Because of necessity, as more and more information becomes available and as the circumstances in which you're living changes, well, I think your view of the past is likely to change. I mean, one obvious illustration of that is the view that was taken of 1916 in 1966 compared to 2016. And one of the odd things about that is that a lot of the people who took part in 16 and who took part in the War of Independence were still alive 50 years on, but they were silent. They're dead 100 years on, but they're very articulate in terms of the amount of material that's available online, where you can actually, so to speak, hear their voices. So that is a wonderful paradox. As I said, in life they were silent, in death they are articulate. And there's no end of material available, and as I say, a lot of it online. There's the Bureau of Military History material, increasingly the material coming online from the pensions applications. Then there's the police material, CO 904 series. People like Richard Mulcahy and Ernie O'Malley were kind of assiduous themselves in subsequently, like Churchill famously did, you write your own history. And they were very intent on doing that and gathering material. We live in an age of Trumpism where apparently there are alternative facts. Well, with regard to history, there aren't any alternative facts. There are, of course, alternative interpretations. And there are lots of different ways of looking at something. One illustration of that, which I hopefully will come to, would be I've chosen to look at the role of the RIC in a very particular, some might even say peculiar way. Anyway, whatever way we're going to look at the war, whatever view we take of the people involved in the 3rd Brigade and in the larger volunteer movement, and even if we're going to be critical, and 100 years on I think we're entitled to be critical if the evidence is there to support it, you still have to start from a point where what these people were doing was extraordinary, and they themselves, and it's a relatively small number of people, were extraordinary. If you think about a British soldier or an officer assigned to Ireland, he may have survived the First World War when various empires were defeated, and then he's sent to Ireland to take on not proper soldiers as he would view it, or trained soldiers, but basically an assortment of clerks, shop assistants and labourers, people that Lloyd George designated as counter-jumpers. Counter-jumpers is another term, of course, for shop assistants. And that's one of the intriguing things about the volunteers in South Tipperary. The number of them who were shop assistants of various kinds. It's something that I've been looking at, and it doesn't seem to have been looked at elsewhere. General Arthur Percival, I don't know if the name resonates, but I mean, his main claim to fame now is that he was the general in charge of the surrender of Singapore, which I suppose was the greatest day of failure for the British Army, but he was involved in the War of Independence in Ireland. And I mean, he was not a stupid man. I suppose you don't get to be a general if you're that stupid. But I mean, he could see what was going on in Ireland, and he had a view that was more positive. He talked about the rebel campaign in Ireland as a national movement backed by a large proportion of the population and is not conducted by a few hired assassins, as was often supposed. I don't know if any of his colleagues would agree with that. So that's the point I'm starting from. While I don't understand, or I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the actions of some of the people involved, they were not ordinary. Just look at the 3rd Brigade. Obviously they're to be put back into the wider context of the volunteers. The volunteer movement starts in the county in various places, different dates, but basically the early part of 1914, whereas it's several years before the 3rd Brigade comes into being, and the names most associated with the leadership of the 3rd Brigade. So to understand the 3rd Brigade, one has to take a much longer look at the volunteers. There's a wonderful story which I saw last year, because one of the books published last year was a kind of a memoir written by Owen MacNeill, and written a long time ago, but it was only published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission last year. And he has this story that sometime in the 1920s, he was travelling by train, coming back from a League of Nations meeting, so he was on train going somewhere across France. And he came across an English journalist who happened to be the editor of the Times newspaper during the War of Independence, so obviously would have been very caught up with what was happening in Ireland. So they went into a conversation, and he asked MacNeill, what now that he could kind of really, years later, could speak his mind, what was the cause of the revolution in Ireland? What brought it about? And MacNeill had a very simple answer, just he said mainly by Carson. Because Carson, reacting to the Home Rule movement, founded the volunteers in Dublin, and that led to the volunteers. And MacNeill, of course, was central to that, even though he was being manipulated by the IRB. So the volunteers, I'm not sure that Eamon O'Dear, who's a central figure, particularly in 1916, he has talked about the volunteers being established in his area late 1913, but I think he might have been one of these people who wanted to be the first of everything. I don't know that there's any other evidence than what he's saying. So the volunteer movement gets going in the early part of 1914. And it's a coming together really of the present, but also the very intense consciousness of the past. So in various places, in Feather, for example, they don't gather just anywhere, they gather at a place where back in 1798, at least folk memory said the English had their camp. In Bancha, they gathered just outside the village at a place which reputedly was where white boys had gathered at an earlier period. In Tipperary town, they gathered at Garna County, where the Fenians had gathered back in 66-67. In Carrick-on-Suir, memories of Maher and O'Brien were involved. At Ballingarry, of course, where it was put in the Warhouse, and so on. In Clare, I'm not so sure. They weren't that quick off the mark. But you can see how there's an intense consciousness. This is present-day politics in 1914, but it's also coming from this legacy from the past. If you pay attention to Labour politics today, literally today and yesterday, there's this whole issue of entryism, of movements that are taken as being somewhat subversive, trying to get control of what is an open organisation. Well, if you follow that kind of politics, you'll understand what the IRB was trying to do. And at a national level, you have people like Mellors and McDermott, who I suppose we would see as somewhat heroic figures, but it's also important to remember that the Ireland that they wanted isn't the Ireland with which we would have been happy, assuming that we're all fairly middle class and right-wing in our politics. Locally, you had people in every town. In Tipperary, you had a chap who had a cycle shop called Willie Ben. In Clonmel, you had Frank Drohan. In Cashel, you had a post office worker, P.C. O'Mahony. Basically, there was at least one individual in every community who was the IRB organiser. And the most important one of all, I suppose, in this region would be Eamon O'Dwyer in the Drum region, very much was brought to notice during the 2016 commemoration. For somebody like Pierce McCann, very much a gentleman farmer, the volunteers was a wonderful opportunity to embrace what was a kind of a zeitgeist all over Europe, where people were embracing a kind of a militarisation where you got to wear uniforms and do a bit of parading backwards and forwards. The other thing about McCann, of course, is that he was a very respectable figure and was a kind of a counterbalance to people on the more conservative side. And a lot of the stuff that goes on in South Tipperary, and the heartland, which again isn't something I fully understood until I started looking into this, is very much Midwest Tipperary. So if you take the 5 towns that are in South Tipperary, I mean, and this is not something anyone will hear me say too often, but if you think of it in football terms, Tipperary is absolutely, I mean Tipperary town, is in the 1st division. Cashel is in the 2nd division. Clonmel is in the 3rd, and Carrick and Clare are in the 4th. And that's the pecking order. And really Midwest Tipperary is in a category very much of its own. And as far as the control of the volunteers was concerned, the IRB, as I say, was behind the scene. You had somebody like McCann, you had O'Dear, and then in Tipperary, and this was in county-wide, just so happened that the parish priest in Tipperary and the town clerk in Tipperary were very much the key figures on the Redmond, the Home Rule side. So McCann was a kind of a counterbalance to that. Then the war breaks out, and of course, the 2 main developments. First of all, as far as Home Rule is concerned, the way I would always think about it is, if you think of some political policy that's been pushed since 1970s, and it's now 2016, 2017, in this case for the war, 2014, just if you push it forward to our own day, and if this policy's been there since the 1970s and we're still waiting for it, and finally it's supposed to come and it's postponed yet again, well, I don't think it's difficult to understand how people, particularly younger people, would just abandon that as being absolutely hopeless. As far as the war then is concerned, there was no problem with the Irish joining the British Army. I mean, that's something they'd been doing since ever. I mean, I don't suppose there's any Tipperary person of a certain generation who didn't learn the Patrick Sheehan poem when they were in school. I don't know if kids learn it anymore. But you know the story where he's blinded in the Crimean War, and it comes home. Basically, it was written by Kickham as an advertisement not to join the British Army. So the last verse in that: "So Irish youths, dear countrymen, take heed to what I say. For if you join the English ranks, you'll surely rue the day. And whenever you're tempted a soldiering to go, remember poor blind Sheehan from the glen of Ireland. So as I said, there's a long tradition of, for whatever reason, joining. The difference now, of course, is you have I suppose you would regard Redmond as the political leader of Ireland, advocating that people should join as a kind of political policy. And there is an absolutely key date which, if people are interested in counterfactual history, in other words, if various things have gone differently, how the world might have been, and that's a date on the 25th of May. And it may well have been, if things had been differently, that day would be a public holiday, because that's really the day when the Third Home Rule Bill is passed. And if you look at the local press, and look at the reports for every village and every town, and the level of excitement, the level of celebration is quite extraordinary. Something that we now, looking back, would think was, because we know it came to nothing. But at the time, of course, they weren't cursed with hindsight. The level of celebration was quite extraordinary. But then, of course, that's postponed, and then basically Home Rule it's certainly, as far as the 32 counties is concerned, is abandoned, and then Redmond makes his speech on the 20th of September advocating that Irish people should join the British Army. Once the war begins, as far as the volunteers are concerned, there's a huge negative and a huge positive. The huge negative is they lose all their drill instructors, because not having arms, basically all they could do is drill. I mean, if you were trying to enthuse shopkeepers and clerks to come out of an evening, what are they going to do other than drill exercises? So they lost, because they were called back into many of these being in the army were called back in. The more positive thing is there was a brief window of opportunity to actually get access to arms, because for once the kind of establishment embraced the volunteers. So you had people like Lord Donoughmore and so on sending contributions, and various landed gentlemen going out of their way to accommodate the volunteers. It didn't really last that long. One of the things that has changed, in part I think because of the interest in family history, is our attitude to those who joined the volunteers. And it's important to remember, if you look at the overall volunteer movement, people who went and joined the British Army are part of the volunteer movement, just as the people who were in the IRA later. They're all part, it's just they made different choices. And there was a time when the kind of historical narrative was one of the set of those choices was dismissed and not understood, and the other was embraced. That has changed, and as I said, I think in part because many of us doing the roots business have found people in our background that maybe we didn't know or forgot about, who served in the British Army and who died. So as I said, that's one of the things that has changed. One of the points I would make, of course, is looking at those two aspects of the volunteer movement. Somebody who served in the trenches and who may have been killed or who may have survived, and somebody who was in the IRA and went on the run. It's not, if you ask, who had the more difficult life, who had it the toughest, well, clearly it was the guy in the trenches, not the chap on the run. So we need to restore a sense of balance as to the choices that individuals made. Which brings me to that book. People looking at the volunteer movement in other parts of the country, whether it's Limerick that I mentioned or North Tipperary, they don't have the monument, the mountain of Breen's book. Breen's book was absolutely extraordinary in that it was written in the first place, because if you think about it, through the 20s, 30s, 40s, the Tracy biography was in the 40s, and then I suppose you had Barry's book, which is 1949. There really wasn't anything very much in print. So it's not surprising that even today, historians who you might think would know better keep coming back and citing Breen's book. My fight, you might query the pronoun, but it's my fight for Irish freedom. Certainly in terms of his career, it's the most significant thing he did, because it had a huge impact. He is, I suppose, one of the most famous Tipperary men. I mean, you say, who doesn't know the name Dan Breen, and who isn't going to associate it with Tipperary? The odd thing is, of course, for somebody who is so associated with the county, he went out of his way never to live here. And even when in the 1940s he went to buy a farm in debatable circumstances, he certainly didn't buy it in this county. And he had very negative feelings certainly about Tipperary town, and certainly about Cashel. I'm not sure what he felt about Clonmel. I haven't seen any evidence. So he's interesting, and he's a puzzle. And I'm still not clear what to make of him. His book was an enormous success. By the early 40s, it was published by Talbot Press. It had sold something like 40,000 copies, which is just astonishing, given that this wasn't a period when many people actually bought books. If you were a reader, you went to the library and borrowed, you didn't really buy books. He had actually lost control of the copyright, so I don't know that he was making the money from that. He didn't, of course, write the book. It is his story. Yes, I had just one. Michael Laffin wrote a book a few years ago on Sinn Féin. It is the standard authoritative book on Sinn Féin. And yet he has a sentence in that: Dan Breen and his unit carried out the attacks in Salahead and Knocklawn. That's the influence of Breen's book. Of course, it's not correct, but I mean, it is. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things Churchill once said was, I'll control what people will say because I'll get to write at least the first bit of the history. And the person who largely wrote the book was Kitty O'Doherty. Her own name was Gibbons. She was from Westmeath. She was a national teacher working in Dublin. She met and married Seamus O'Doherty from Derry. He worked as a commercial. Actually, he worked for Gills and other publishers. So I'm not sure why they didn't publish Breen's book. It's all the press published. Very much involved in the whole Irish Ireland movement and separatism. They were friendly with a lot of these key Irish Americans like Joe McGarrity and so on. So they lived for some of this period in Philadelphia. So if any of these people ended up in America, it was a kind of a port of call or a kind of a home from home, including, of course, Breen. Their son was later private secretary to Sean Lemass, and interestingly wrote a book about his parents, which is a very useful and interesting source of information. And so from that, he explains the circumstances of Breen's book. Early 1922, Dan Breen visited our home in Philadelphia. He gave my mother notes, which she later used as the basis for his book, which I think is fair enough. I mean, it's not creative writing on her part, it's his story. But I would think she put it together. Breen returned to Ireland in April 1922, and then another quotation from the writer's son. In 1923, my father had advised Breen about publishing his book and had suggested the title. Mother had written the text, but neither of my parents had any financial interest in the work. Breen was paid about £350 by the Talbot Press with royalties of 10%. But in 1925, he parted with the rights for a further lump sum. And you can see why, because, like for so many other anti-treaty people, life was pretty difficult in the 20s. There's a letter, this is there's about 1,000 pages in the files relating to his pensions applications, which is online, so if you have days and days, you can plough through all 1,000 pages. But there's lots of interesting things in there. I mean, there's one, he's writing a letter, this is in 1925, it's written from actually Hollybank Road, which, if you know that part of the city near St. Patrick's College, it's just down the road from Fernside, where, the famous episode happened. But anyway, he's writing from that address, he's writing to McGarrity in New York. And after putting a hard winter over me, I had no work, and no work spells no money. So you can see why he would have lost control. Just a nod, modern, again I'm making the point about how influential the book is. An interesting modern example of the influence of the book. There's a present-day writer called Elizabeth Gillis. She has written stuff on the role of women coming among and so on in the War of Independence period. She wrote and had published in America in very, very kind of expensive handful of copies, maybe I think 75 copies in all, a book about Tracy, Sean Tracy, obviously, whom she very much admires. It's a very slight book, but beautifully produced and obviously quite expensive. But there's a preface to that, and she explains that she came to Tracy through Breen's book, which is just, I'm just citing that as an illustration of the influence of his book. The only thing that comes close to it, of course, is the Desmond Ryan biography of Tracy, which is, the way I would think of it, Breen's book is basically a kind of a solo performance, whereas the Ryan Tracy book is a kind of a choral work, and it has wonderful illustrations and so on. So it's a different kind of book. But there are issues with Tracy as well, because What's missing in the Tracy book is anything about the murderous background of Tracy's family and the circumstances from which he's coming, which has to have had an influence. But there's absolutely no mention. So these are all very interesting, but they're complicated books to deal with. But the Breen one particularly, and I'll come to it, because I said, I'm not going to look at the Solid Beg ambush, but there's very interesting, the issues of the immediate aftermath, I think are particularly interesting. Then, of course, there are the other people involved, like Seamus Robinson and Hogan, this awful phrase. I'm not sure where it originated, the Big Four. Maybe it's originated in Breen's book. But it's totally meaningless because, again, a lot of this material is online, but I mean, there's a huge problem with regard to Hogan. There has been some wonderful radio documentary done recently, which you may have heard on Tipperary Midwest Radio, which is really excellent on Hogan, but I think was unduly positive about his role in this period. The thing about Tracy, which of course is a help, is that because he was killed, he's very much kind of the lost leader, and he wrote nothing. And in a sense, you know, his reputation then shines brightest. His leadership is something anybody was going to criticise. Hogan, as I say, who lived until, I think, 67, 68, made no contribution to the bureaus, so there is no bureau statement. And of all the people, you know, he clearly had a story to tell, but, you know, that's silence. As I said, that Midwest documentary is of great interest. All kinds of problems associated with Hogan. There's the issue of his age. His birth actually would appear to be May 1900, whereas, of course, that great arbiter of facts, Wikipedia, would go for probably a year later. But a lot of this material, the civil registers are online. If you look at the census return, he would appear when he was a small child that he was found out to a Corneel family who were manning a railway crossing in Solhead. Now, what that is about, I don't know. His parents didn't marry until the 27th of November 1905. So there were all kinds of complications. And then his father is dead when he's young. So, and then there's the extraordinary decision that was, and this isn't something that's down to him, but the brigade leadership thought it was a good idea that this child, which is technically what he was, because I would think that he thought that he was the younger age rather than the older. That is certainly what the record suggests. So technically that this child should go on the run with them after the Solid Beg ambush, and there was absolutely no necessity for him to go on the run. It's not as if there was a surplus of labour to look after the farm at home. There was just his mother and a younger brother, and then what happened, the younger brother was hugely, well, put it no other way, unpleasant. Then he had to live with, again, choosing my words carefully, the whole issue leading to not long. Well, I'm calling it here age-mandated hormonal imperative. Well, that means you can work out for yourself, but because of what I'm calling an age-mandated hormonal imperative, 4 men died. And he's still a teenager, effectively. Why? I mean, if you have 18 or 19-year-olds at home, or if you have sons who were once that age and you can think back to what they're like, what kind of leadership capacity do you think people had at that age? So, as I said, this is one of the issues in dealing with this. Why leadership, the brigade leadership, would think it was a good idea to take him and to allow him to go on the run. I don't know. As I said, with regard to the ambush, I'm not getting into the details of it. The bit that fascinates me most about is the immediate aftermath. And one of the issues for discussion, of course, with regard to the ambush is the intention of killing policemen or not. So is it theft or murder? And the Breen line is, well, the later Breen line is that the intention was to kill policemen, and, you know, the famous thing, he only wished there were more of them there that he could have, and made a bigger splash. The problem with I would incline to the view that what was intended was theft, not murder. I say murder because that's how the police would have viewed it. It's not a kind of a value judgment. If you look at Breen's book and his account of the immediate aftermath of the ambush, It's, again, given if you're reading it and you're living in Tipperary town, where you're close to the Galties. It gives you their itinerary, which I'm not going to go into, but there's one bit where Tracy falls into a 20-foot ravine, okay. Then there's Tracy, Breen and Hogan. Robinson has gone off himself. They continue on their way towards Galtymore. Okay, it's January, it's freezing, and they're going to go over Galtymore. So they cross the glen and climb Galtymore slopes. This is Breen's account. They stick out for 3 hours. What equipment, what clothing did they have? Again, as I say, it's a very cold January. I don't know if any of you have ever been up on the slopes of Galtymore. And eventually lost our bearings. They abandoned all hope of crossing the mountain, so clearly they don't get to the summit, but they pull back and then make alternative arrangements. The only way I can interpret that, and I'm taking Breen kind of at his word that that is the direction in which they headed, is that what was intended was theft and not murder, because I mean, it seems logical to me that the police will react in an entirely different way to theft than they will to murder, and particularly if the murder is up to two of their own. So, I mean, even if you had a bunch of very incompetent bank robbers planning a robbery, and you saw it on a screen in the movie, you would expect a scene whereby they're planning their getaway. Okay, we robbed the bank, what happens next? Where do we go? And there doesn't seem to be any kind of clear plan as to who's to do what or who's to go where. So one way of understanding that is that, of course, for such plans as they had were based on theft, but what they were left with was, and as I said, it's not a value judgment, it's how the police would view it, what they were left with was murder. So hence their, on the face of it, insane attempt to go over Galtymore in January. An aspect of this that's always totally overlooked, there is a kind of a standard narrative with regard to the War of Independence, that in 1919 you have Solid Beg, and then in May you have what happens in Not Long, and not an awful lot happens in 1919, and then the whole thing, Black and Tans come the early part of 19, and the whole thing gets going. So the War of Independence is really a kind of a later 1920, and then it's very intense up to July 1921. That's kind of the narrative. And, you know, that's perhaps true for most of the country. It is not true for Midwest Tipperary. I mean, you know, the ambush happens in Solid Beg, which is outside Tipperary town. So somebody is going to pay the price. Well, the price is paid by Tipperary town and district, which is, again, as I said, is an aspect of this that's overlooked. I mean, the day after the ambush, South Riding is proclaimed a special military area, which means that the holding of or taking part in meetings, assemblies, fairs, markets, all prohibited. Pubs have to close early. So the impact on the town economically is absolutely devastating, because Tipperary town is a market town, and there was a fair every month, and that was the absolutely crucial, and then there were markets and Saturdays and so on, but that monthly fair was, and that was all banned. And then in mid-February, of course, to add insult to injury, the South Tipperary military area that was first is reduced in size, so Clonmel and Carrick are excluded. So it's bad enough you're doing no business, but there's no problems. Auctioneers went and conducted their business in Doon and Doola, because of course it's not in, these are places that are not in Tipperary. So the impact on Tipperary town was absolutely devastating. You had constant raids, and I'll come in a few minutes to look at the role of the RIC and their particular and peculiar concept of I mean, there's a house, if I don't know if you know Tipperary town, but there's a house in Church Street, which is now the DSP office, but it was the main place where the people who were most involved in coming them on. Two ladies who were there, they had a business, but their niece was the woman that Tracy was, I think, going to marry. So he met her and met them there very often. But because they were such known entities, they were raided almost weekly in the weeks after after the ambush. The woman's name was Alice Ryan. Barlow's, I mean, all the kind of names that resonate, endlessly raided. So basically, I have just use a phrase, it's like basically the authorities were swatting at flies without waiting for one to land. I mean, it was just they were striking out. And when I come to look at the RIC and their use of kidnapping as a policing technique, you can see just how desperate they were. I've gone through the details of of the impact on Tipperary town and district. And just to give you an illustration, just how kind of intense it was. Between the ambush, the 21st of January, and the end of March, so I'm not even looking through 1919, that's just a few weeks, there are 95 separate incidents relating to the town and the immediate district in terms of police activity. And when you see that police search a place, that doesn't mean they come in politely. Basically, assuming they find nothing, they leave total devastation behind them. Because more was involved than just searching the place. It was a means of intimidation. And of course the impact, the town had 90 pubs, many of also doubled, of course, as groceries, and with the curtailment of their closing hours. Again, that's just the early part of 1919. When you come to the later part of 1920, there's massive devastation in the town with lots of premises are burned down. People kind of know about stuff that happened in Thurles. Nobody pays attention. That's me telling me to shut up. Nobody pays attention to what happened in Tipperary. The devastation was much more intense. For a particular reason. There was a military barracks in Tipperary. That's not, I mean, there was one in Clare, there was one in Clonmel. The thing about the Tipperary one is there was also a military hospital. So anytime soldiers were wounded or killed, for a wide area around about, Tipperary was where they were brought back to. And so when the funerals went out to send the bodies back to England, which is mainly where they were sent, the cortege would leave the Tipperary barracks and go to the junction. And of course the instruction would go out that all the shops were to close as a mark of respect. But equally the injunction would go out from the IRA for the shops to stay open. So you had the poor shopkeepers so they probably, as you know, because of the fairs, all these shops had wooden shutters, so maybe they put one up instead of two. I don't know how they managed it. Looking at the role of the RIC, as I say, they went completely crazy. There has been a book recently written about the RIC in Tipperary, but oddly it doesn't deal with what is kind of the most extraordinary aspect of the RIC, and that is their use of kidnapping as a kind of a technique for policing, which means that whatever about the RIC anywhere else, in Tipperary they completely and absolutely lose all moral authority. What really brings this home to me is something I was doing which is separate to this. There's a chap who died fighting for the Australian Army. He died in the Western Front in 1918. So next year is his anniversary. So I've written an article about him. But there's an aspect of his career which kind of has brought home the role of the RIC to me. He emigrated from Tipperary, went to Australia, joined the police. He ended up in Papua New Guinea, which basically still had cannibals and was one of the most remote places in the world. I've never met anybody who's been to Papua New Guinea. I'm sure people have nowadays, but it's still very remote. Within a very short time, he was in charge of law and order and of policing over a huge swathe of Papua New Guinea. To help him, he had no other white people, but he had some local tribespeople who were kind of slightly westernized. A little bit more than the people with whom they were dealing. As I said, there was still cannibalism there. This chap's father, back in Tipperary, was involved in the land struggle and would have regarded the RIC as very much the enemy. So here you have his son, and within a very short time, he's involved in the administration of police. The technique, of course, is the one where you assimilate part of the local population to control the rest of it, if you like. Statistics can be very misleading. Occasionally you come across a statistic which is startling. In terms of how the police were organised, obviously you had the constable who was in charge. At the local level you had various grades of constables, you had sergeant, you had head constable and so on. Then you had a district inspector. But the absolute, within that whole structure, the key person was the county inspector. Because some counties are divided, obviously Tipperary and some others, there weren't 32 county inspectors, there were 37. So a question was asked in the House of Commons in 1916, how many of the county inspectors were Catholic? And so you can just think to yourself what a number might be out of 37. And this is 116 years after the Act of Union, when Ireland is supposed to be part of the United Kingdom. Well, the answer, out of 37, 4 were Catholic. So we know the policing as the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary. Now, I'm sure you know that they were given the designation Royal in 1867 because of their huge success in combating illegal distillation, which was a problem, all those people brewing all that poitín. Of course they weren't. 1867, they were given the designation Royal because they defeated, or at least it was seen that they defeated the Fenians. So there is a kind of a more modern view of the RIC, that they kind of functioned as a normal, quote-unquote, police force. Maybe some of the time they did. But their primary function was to combat what was seen as political subversion. So they were certainly on the front line. There is a problem, which I'm not sure what the answer is, with South Tipperary. If the war was going to be taken most effectively to the enemy, the targets should have been the district inspectors and the county inspectors. Now, some district inspectors got their comeuppance, so to speak, in North Tipperary. That's not something that happened in the south. The policing in the south, after Salahead Beg, became concentrated on kidnapping. And they kidnapped a series of children. The son of the workman in Tracy's farm. It's not as if the police didn't know who was involved in Salahead Beg. Partly the clue, of course, was these people were, as the papers used to put it, not at home. They were on the run. You had Hogan's younger brother. You had an unfortunate child who was employed by the county council near the quarry, involved in the ambush. And then you had Dan Breen's nephew. There is an interview with Matthew Hogan, Sean's younger brother, who's not dead terribly long. And he's asked he's an old man, but he's asked in the interview about his experience being kidnapped, taken by the police, brought to the depot in Phoenix Park, then ever so often brought into Dublin Castle and questioned, brought back, and he's kept there for weeks. And the extraordinary thing is, it just shows you how you can't necessarily trust first-hand evidence. He makes very light of the experience. But that cannot have been the case if you think of a child who had never been from home and subjected to those kind of conditions. As I say, with regard to the workmen on the Tracy farm, one of the people who got involved in that, various agencies in Dublin, his name was Connors, seized by armed police on his way home from Marnane National School, and within sight of the school carried off to Limerick Junction en route for Dublin. The children who accompanied at the time fled terror-stricken across the fields when they saw him being seized by the police. His parents were left in complete ignorance of his fate, and so on. And then, as I said, another one of the children who was taken was Breen's nephew. His mother was Breen's sister. The child's father was a creamery worker. And there's a description of that. On the 5th of March last, this is from the mother, I and my two little boys, aged 8 and 4, were in my own house when about 11 o'clock a body of armed police came in. Some searched my house and made me remain where I was while the district inspector and the sergeant took my child, 8 years old, to an outhouse and kept him there the whole long day till 5 o'clock in the evening. They questioned him and coaxed him at first and then threatened to drive a pencil down his throat if he didn't tell them who shot the police and where the arms, etc. were hidden. And they also threatened to shoot him. I heard the little boy crying and asked to be let out, but was not allowed. After a long time, I asked to be allowed to bring him tea and something to eat, but was again refused. Now the fire was dying out, and I wouldn't be allowed to get coal from the outhouse, and out the fire went. Meantime, my husband came home for his dinner and was held up outside and searched and questioned and kept for hours. We had no dinner, so we were without food or fire till the police eventually left, taking with them some clothes belonging to my husband. My little boy had only just recovered after being 3 weeks in bed. This was the time of the flu epidemic. And this treatment brought on an enormous shock. I had to send for the doctor the next day, who promised to write and complain of the cruel conduct. Both my boys are terrified of police since. I bet they were. Now, he wasn't actually carted off to Dublin Castle, but you can see it's an extraordinary self-defeating exercise, because, as I said, whatever moral authority the police had, and it isn't as if any of this was not known. I mean, everybody in the region knew that this was been going on. Those that were taken to Dublin were kept there. I mean, this is late January. They were kept there until April. So we are talking a long period of time. And, you know, if you use a degree of imagination to think, and these are small young children who are totally bewildered by what's going on. The whole thing was an extraordinary own goal for the police. What I don't understand is why the IRA in the region didn't do much more selective targeting of police, particularly the leadership of the police. But then there is this issue, which again I haven't quite come to terms with. I mean, the War of Independence is, right, the Solid Beg ambush through to the truce, so, you know, 21st January, whatever it is, 11th of July. For most of that period, Breen and Tracy, they're not in Tipperary. I mean, they're either in flight or they're in Dublin. And you might say, well, they had no choice. Well, of course they had choice. Callahan, after he killed 2 policemen in 1916, managed to stay very much in the region and was hidden. And if you say, okay, well, the argument is they were in Dublin because they were safer in Dublin. Well, Tracy was killed in Dublin, and Breen was almost killed. I mean, the whole thing, in part, I would think, was some kind of bad adrenaline rush, because while it was terribly difficult in Dublin, because every morning you woke up, there was no certainty where you were going to sleep that night. I mean, you know, it was an extraordinarily itinerant life, living from hand to mouth. But it had the virtue of being exciting. But these were the people who were the leaders of the 3rd Brigade, and I don't get it how you lead by absence. There was a period in the summer of 1920 when Breen was very much here and very much involved with battalions around in the region, involved in training. And Tracy was very charismatic, and he had, you know, a big impact. But then all of a sudden, you know, he has to go back to Dublin. This is just before he's killed. Nowhere is it explained why he had to go back to Dublin. You know, what skill set was he bringing that wasn't available already in Dublin? I don't know. As I said, that's one of the issues. Insofar as there was leadership and training, it came from outside. There was a chap early on, McLaughlin, and then later there was O'Malley, you know, both outsiders who came in and were involved in a degree of training. There is also the whole issue of the whole Robinson-Breen feud, which you can read about online. It's terribly tedious. Robinson's huge problem, I would think, is that he's just an outsider. I mean, if you think, even still, how much more so then, 100 years ago, did it matter that people knew who you were, particularly if you were trying to exercise that kind of political leadership. And here you have this person, Robinson, who has absolutely no contacts, no roots in the area, and speaks funny into the bargain. So he really does stand out. There is an issue with Tracy, in that, as far as I can see, on 3 different occasions when leadership was either kind of being offered to him or he was looking for it, he missed out. So as you know, he was number 2 within the brigade area, not number 1. Breen has a particular interpretation of what was going on, which very much denigrates Robinson's role, none of which makes sense. The brigade, of course, was formed at a meeting in Tipperary Town, which is appropriate, because as I said, Tipperary Town is the town within the region that was most centrally involved in all that was going on. You have this version from Breen that there was a manipulation, that while Tracy was really going to control the brigade, they would have Robinson as a front man. Well, given that what you're talking about is a military command, to begin by confusing the lines of command makes absolutely no sense, which is something I would imagine Mulcahy, who had his problems with them, readily understood. So as I say, I'm trying to work out what exactly was going on. There's also an issue, of course, that one has to be careful if you're looking at the view of people from the Bureau of Military History statements. You have to be clear what line the witness took in the Civil War, because that, of course, colours what view they're going to take of the War of Independence. And as I said, the most astonishing thing is that the brigade leadership is not, the 3rd Brigade, they're not here for most of the time. And I don't really understand that. As I said, maybe somebody has some simple explanations to why they're not here, I don't know. They took part in various events in Dublin, the attempt to kill the Viceroy and so on. But as I said, it's not as if they were bringing a skill set that wasn't available from some other individuals. So that doesn't really answer the question. O'Malley was the one who had a much bigger impact than any of the homegrown leaders. O'Malley, again, had the virtue that he got his view out by writing his book, which is seen as something of a classic. The problem with it is that it's too much of a on another man's wound, it's too much of a literary construct. He has a description in that where he's talking about 3 British soldiers, or they're young officers who were kidnapped over around Feathered, and whom he, according to his evidence, he ordered to have them executed without any really good reason. But if you read his book, it's clearly it's kind of a literary construct, that he's not just telling a story, but he's doing it in a particularly literary way. And of course, everybody knows the famous Frank O'Connor story, Guests of the Nation. He's, I think, influenced by that. So it's just what's going on is I don't know, it's distasteful in some way. But nonetheless, he had a very significant role in terms of the training, a role not provided by. That's, yes, coming back to Breen's book, of course, there is a problem too with Breen claiming to be at some events that, there's no other evidence that he was at, which I suppose is human nature, that when he came to tell his story, he was going to, want to be as much on stage as possible, and, if for some events he wasn't there, well and good, I suppose you could kind of do a little bit of obfuscation, I suppose is the polite word. Then the last thing I want to look at, that's always a good word when you're having a talk, the last of anything. The last thing is this issue of, which again, because it's not really looked at, is that under cover of the agitation going on these political issues, you had a kind of an element of opportunism. And there's one particular episode which I find fascinating. As you know, Sinn Féin set up an alternative court system as part of their attempt to kind of, oust the British control. So there was a chap from Dundrum who was arrested, and the problem with, of course, running an army is that you have to keep up the paperwork, which was always a problem for Robinson. Quite often they were kind of caught and having to run with their papers. But occasionally when people were arrested, incriminating documents were found on them. Anyway, this chap was arrested, and among the papers found on him was an indictment from the Irish Republican Army. And the indictment was, it's interesting anyway, but it's particularly interesting because the person against whom the indictment was made was Owen Davern. And Owen Davern is Michael Davern's father. Now, Michael Davern, of course, is very much involved in the IRA. Everybody here knows subsequently it was a TD, Davern family, all the rest of it. Owen Davern had been a parliamentary party member and a Redmondite, and had been, quote-unquote, persuaded to stand aside in favour. So clearly there was a difference in politics. Anyway, what was it that the IRA were charging him with? Well, being responsible for having a threatening letter sent to John Maxwell, who was a Protestant farmer over around Donegal, and that you did threaten and abuse, said John Maxwell, and that you also used language likely to disturb and annoy members of the Republican Army. And by concocting and sending this threatening letter, you caused great trouble and annoyance to Maxwell, and also played into the hands of the English government, who could make propaganda out of this, that the IRA, this is the argument that goes on in Cork, that they were targeting Protestants. Well, it's a version of that in Tipperary. And so they didn't like, apart from The reason, cutting a long story, that Owen Davern was doing this was, of course, he was minded well and good if he could get Maxwell out of his land, because Maxwell hadn't come in as an emergency man, which was often what was said, from an evicted farm, so that he had no right to be there. The farm in question was part of the estate of Bagwell Purify from Capel and Bagwell Purify eventually intervened in this to say, no, Maxwell bought this farm, there was nobody evicted, he's perfectly entitled to be there. But the game that Davern was obviously playing was stirring the pot, so well and good if you get rid of him and maybe move in on the land. The whole thing was, I would imagine for Michael Davern, must have been extraordinarily embarrassing. The outcome, of course, is that Maxwell stays in his land and dies in his bed several years later. But it's just an example. I've only come across one undoubted example, which again goes on, because this is a controversy that's still ongoing in Cork, that the IRA were deliberately targeting Protestant families. I've only found one example where clearly somebody was murdered for reasons having to do with the past, and that the present politics was used as an excuse. And that's George Lycett, who was murdered. And in his case, they clearly were emergency men. They bought into a farm in Kilbury. The farm family had been evicted, and they were still there and still making noise and still protesting. So there was no doubt that there were kind of reasons. So somebody or some group of people clearly used the opportunity of the War of Independence to settle old scores. Other Protestants were killed, but that's the only example I've come across which I would be absolutely certain is an example of the kind of thing that was going on in Cork. Yes, 1 hour. As I say, it's not, tonight wasn't intended to be an account of the War of Independence from first to last. It would be in South Tipperary, it would be far too big a topic. I just wanted to raise some of the matters that arise from somebody trying to deal with it. I'm sure maybe in the next few minutes some of you might have some wonderful answers. Anyway, that's all I have to say for you, so thank you very much.